Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Shepard, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Richard Nixon Foundation. The foundation co-sponsors these Nixon Legacy Forums with the National Archives. In essence, the archives has the documents, and we tend to produce the people who produce the documents. So they have the what and the when. We try to produce the how and the why. And the perfect partner to do this with us is the head of the National Archives. I introduce at this time David Ferriero, the 10th Archivist of the United States. David?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here for another Nixon Legacy Forum here at the National Archives. Today's forum will be the 20th in an ongoing series that began at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda back in January 2010, Richard Nixon's 97th birthday, January 9th, with a forum on the creation of the Domestic Council and the Office of Management and Budget early in the President's first term. The Nixon Legacy Forums assemble Nixon administration officials, the men and women who helped to formulate and carry out the President's policies, to remember and discuss and analyze the work they did during those important years between 1969 and 1974. When these recollections and reminiscences and analyses of the people who created the papers are combined with the relevant documents and tapes, they provide a rich and unique resource for scholars and citizens in all the years ahead. Forums so far have dealt with such varied topics as the peaceful desegregation of Southern schools in 1970, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the appointment of 4 justices to the United States Supreme Court, and the way the Nixon White House was organized in order to maximize use of the President's time. Last month, here in the McGowan Theater, we hosted a forum discussing the international aspects of Pat Nixon's long career of public service, and particularly during her years as First Lady. That forum was part of the events surrounding the special exhibit, People Were Her Project, that opened at the Nixon Library last month on March 16th, which would have been Mrs. Nixon's 100th birthday. Many of the legacy forums have been carried on C-SPAN and are available online on demand at the C-SPAN archive. All of the forums are recorded on video and are available on demand at the Nixon Foundation's website. And the videos and transcripts, of course, will always be available to scholars at the Nixon Library. Next month, on May 23rd, the Nixon Legacy Forum will convene at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. 2 panels will consider the Nixon administration's pivotal and groundbreaking approach to Native Americans as set out in President Nixon's landmark special message to Congress on Indian Affairs in July 1970. This afternoon's Legacy Forum will consider one of the most important, but perhaps one of the least known of the Nixon administration's accomplishments in the area of foreign policy, the remarkable alignment of ideas and personalities and events that led to a major shift in American policy toward the Middle East during 1973 and 1974. President Nixon, along with President Sadat of Egypt, forged the first peace between Israel and an Arab neighbor. And the Nixon policy implemented by Henry Kissinger's remarkable exercise of shuttle diplomacy laid the foundation for the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt in 1978. The forum will be introduced by Robert C. McFarlane, who played his own part in the foreign policy of the Nixon years. Bud McFarlane is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and for 19 years was an officer in the United States Marine Corps. His service included 2 combat tours in Vietnam, for which he received the Bronze Star and the Navy Commendation Medal, both with a Combat V. In 1971, he was selected as a White House Fellow and then stayed on at the White House as military assistant to Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council. President Ford named Lieutenant Colonel McFarlane his special assistant for national security affairs. In 1979, he worked for the Senate Armed Services Committee and in 1981 appointed counselor of the Department of State. In 1984, President Reagan named him National Security Advisor. More recently, Bud has worked on international energy issues, and last year he co-founded the United States Energy Security Council. It's my privilege to welcome Bud McFarlane to the stage.
Thanks very much, both for hosting this at the National Archives, for giving a focus to a period of time in our history which is perhaps unprecedented in the number of issues globally, notable for the profound changes that occurred in the power balance between the United States and the Soviet Union, the conclusion of war in Vietnam, the establishment of an opening to China, and perhaps most importantly, a period of intense engagement in the Middle East in the interest of establishing both a process and a framework for advancing toward peace that has been underscored in agreements that followed the Nixon administration. This afternoon we have a panel of distinguished diplomats who were truly present at that creation. Period of intense diplomacy in the Middle East. They will frame for you the formation of policy, that is, the President's concept from coming into office concerning the opportunities in the Middle East for advancing toward greater stability, and then carried out at a very difficult time. Difficult between the United States and the Soviet Union, just the beginning of our relationships with China, and trying to wind up a war in Vietnam to deal with war in the Middle East that ended ultimately with our being faced with an oil embargo from the OPEC countries, but with a profound change in the relationship between the United States and Egypt, which foreshadowed an ability to engage with a new leader in in Egypt, that enabled the peace accord that ultimately was consummated at Camp David in the following administration. The diplomats before you today were party to that intense diplomacy of the period. To introduce them from your left, Ambassador Richard Murphy, distinguished diplomat and serving as ambassador in posts from Mauritania to Syria to Saudi Arabia, and ultimately heading the Middle East Bureau at the Department of State. Ambassador Sam Lewis, similarly, career Foreign Service officer who served with great distinction during his period of time in the Carter administrations as well as the Reagan years and beyond as our distinguished ambassador to Israel, later as head of the policy and planning staff at the Department of State. Dr. Bill Quandt, perhaps the key staffer at the National Security Council in the White House in the period of the October War and the diplomacy which followed, truly at the right hand of Dr. Kissinger, and a noted scholar chronicling that period and the definitive book on that war and the ensuing shuttle diplomacy that followed it. Next to him, Hal Saunders, the lead staffer, not just in the Nixon years, but going back to the Kennedy and Johnson years, and truly the man with the solid foundation that was responsible for advising Dr. Kissinger as, for the first time, he engaged in the Middle East in a sustained way. Later heading the Middle East Bureau at the Department of State under Secretary Henry Kissinger. And finally, the moderator of our panel today, Ambassador Dennis Ross, well known, established, as perhaps the most learned and wise counsel to 4 presidents over the past 25 years on Middle East matters. Dennis, panelist, let's talk about the Middle East.
Well, thank you. As you heard Bud say, the panelists, who are all sitting to my right, embody not only a wealth of insights, experience, and an awful lot of practical know-how, but they've thought a lot about this subject. They range in terms of their experience with regard to the period of time we're going to talk about, basically 69 to 74, from those who actually were hands-on in terms of developing the policy and implementing it during part of this period, to those who were in governmental posts this time and were not necessarily part of that process in an intimate way, but nonetheless were observing it from where they were. They're a unique blend of insight and experience, and we're going to talk about a lot of the issues in this period. And let me sort of summarize some of the issues and then frame maybe the context in which a lot of this takes place before posing a series of questions to all of them. You know, the first thing to keep in mind when we talk about 69 to 74 is this is a tumultuous period internationally, but obviously in the Middle East as well. In the end of 69, we see that the United States puts forward something called the Rogers Plan. The Rogers Plan is actually a proposal designed to try to end the conflict, or at least change fundamentally the dynamic of conflict resolution in the Middle East and between Arabs and Israelis. And that's at the end of December. That's at the end of 1969. It takes place in the context of something that was called the War of Attrition, that had already been ongoing between Egypt and Israel, and that escalates dramatically during the course of 1970 to a point where, in fact, you have Israeli and Soviet pilots engaging in dogfights above the canal, tremendous potential for escalation. There's a ceasefire that is achieved in August of 1970, and it's succeeded a month later by something that's known as Black September, which leads to another crisis, which eventually gets resolved, and we'll talk a little bit about it as well. Sadat comes onto the scene in the aftermath of that because Nasser dies. He has a year of decision, and then he expels the Soviets in 1972. And then in 1973, there's a war. There's a war that surprises us, surprises the Israelis. The war itself is marked by different phases. It's also marked by a significant potential for escalation and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And yet what emerges from that war is the launching of a significant diplomacy. And that diplomacy that is launched sets in process and in motion a lot of what follows over the succeeding years in terms of peacemaking. Now, it's also occasioned, that war, by an Arab oil boycott. Shortly before the end of the Nixon tenure, there is also a trip to the Middle East. I want to get into some questions to the panelists. I also want you to be aware in the audience that we'll probably, as we get to near the end of the discussion on 74, at least, we'll show a clip on the President Nixon's trip to Egypt. But before we get into the questions of the panel, let me just offer a couple of observations, and then we'll turn to the questions. One, when President Nixon comes into power, his initial preoccupation, not surprisingly, is Vietnam. He has campaigned and declared that he's going to end the war. And so, not surprisingly, given the character of what the war has been and the impact it's had domestically in this country, that's a preoccupation. But he views the world through a certain lens. He and Henry Kissinger together are realists in a very traditional, dare I say it, political science sense of the word. They believe that power is an organizing principle around which international relations takes place. And if you're talking about power as an organizing principle, then the guiding relationship is actually the US-Soviet relationship, because these are the two superpowers on the world stage. And his view of the Soviet Union is an interesting and complex one. He comes in with what I would describe as both a competitive and a cooperative approach. He is very heavily determined to try to change the character of the relationship. He is mindful of the profound risk of nuclear war. He wants to remove that as a kind of Damocles sword that hangs over our heads. He wants to see if there is some way to create a different basis for the relationship, not in any way informed by a kind of naivete that we and the Soviets are going to come and have a common set of bonds, but rather he believes you can build a certain kind of relationship that is respectful, that is rooted in predictability, rooted in stability, but in many ways is also shaped by his competitive impulses and his awareness that to produce this kind of relationship that he wants, there is a need for us to build leverage. There is a need for us to be able to exercise influence. There is a need for us to think in terms of trade-offs. And I want to read you a quote from his memoirs that reflects how he thinks about the Soviet Union. And it is a kind of interesting point of departure for us. And I'm quoting, since U.S.-Soviet interests as the world's two competing superpowers were so widespread and overlapping, it was unrealistic to separate or compartmentalize areas of concern. Therefore, we decided to link progress in such areas of Soviet concern as strategic arms limitation and increased trade with progress in areas important to the United States: Vietnam, the Middle East, and Berlin. And again, you listen to that quote, and what it reflects is someone who believes that you can do business with them, but there's trade-offs here. He's not going to give things away to the Soviet Union. He's going to engage on things that should be of mutual interest, but if they really want progress in particular areas, you know, they're going to have to pay for that progress by being responsive to us in things and areas that matter particularly to us. Now, Vietnam, as I said, was the first item he listed, but the Middle East was the second one that he listed. And it is interesting that I made a reference to the Rogers Plan earlier, and he wrote about it again in his memoirs. When he writes about the Rogers Plan, which is an initiative on our part to affect the diplomacy and try to see if we can produce some kind of dramatic change with regard to conflict in the Middle East, when he writes about it, he basically says, I knew the Rogers Plan couldn't be implemented. And yet he said, I wanted us to pursue it because I wanted us to demonstrate to the Arabs that we didn't dismiss the case that they had to make, and I wanted to use it as a vehicle for them to be able to restore their diplomatic relations with us. So he was thinking about the Middle East. He clearly saw that as having tremendous explosive potential, again, relating to the issue of potential confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I wanted to ask Bill, who wasn't in the White House at this point, but he is a chronicler of this period, and he has studied the period. What was the essence of the Rogers Plan? What kind of lied behind promoting it? And why, if it was designed to sort of reach out to the Arabs, why does Nasser reject it?
Well, as far as I can reconstruct what was going on in the president's mind, he did look at the Middle East as a very explosive area of the world. He sometimes made the analogy that the Middle East in the 1960s was like the Balkans before World War I. A small clash could begin in a region and could all of a sudden draw in the major powers and lead to global war. So he wanted to do something to defuse the danger of an explosion in the Middle East. He had Kissinger fully occupied with the opening to China, with Vietnam, and he says in one of his early comments about why he isn't using isn't using Kissinger on the Middle East. He says Henry has a problem dealing with the Israelis. In other words, he's not going to be as fair-minded. And so he has asked his Secretary of State to take on this one area of the Middle East as his main project. He doesn't include him much on Vietnam, as far as I can tell, or on U.S.-Soviet issues, or on China, but the Middle East is given to the State Department. And you just saw a clip of Joe Sisko. He was Assistant Secretary of State. And the State Department put together a project that was meant to be a U.S.-Soviet joint proposal. And the idea was that there would be a proposal on how Egypt and Israel should negotiate a peace. That is the basic terms of reference. And similarly, Jordan and Israel. We would take primary responsibility for shaping principles for that as well. And had this all worked the way it was designed to work, in October, we and the Russians would have jointly announced these proposals as something we agreed on, and we would then go respectively to our friends and clients, they to the Egyptians, we to the Israelis, to try to persuade them. This is 69 we're talking about. The Soviets balk. They say, we're not going to present something unless we know that Egypt will accept it. Nasser won't accept it. So the Soviets step back. At that point, in December of 69, we go forward with these as our own proposals. The reason Nasser objects to it is not so much the substance on just the Egyptian-Israeli part, but it is designed to be a separate Egyptian-Israeli peace. And at this point, Nasser still thinks of himself as the leader of the Arab world. And the Syrians and the Palestinians and the Jordanians should all be in this with Egypt, and he's not going to go separately. So he turns it down. The Israelis turn it down, and the Jordanians subsequently also don't accept it. So this is the first initiative, and it's stillborn. Nobody accepts it. Nobody does. And so it's a failure, but if you go back and actually read the text of the Egyptian-Israeli proposal, it's very close to what came into focus a decade later with the Egyptian-Israeli peace. The principles are almost identical.
So Hal, you were there. Let me ask you a question. Kissinger is clearly dubious about the essence of the Rogers Plan. Does he simply acquiesce in it, number one, because he thinks the president wants it? And number two, is he that keen himself to be involved in the Middle East at this point? And if not, why not?
I think he was very uncertain about the foundations for involving himself. This, as you said earlier, was not his area. And I remember one of my first contacts with him, I was on the NSC staff during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, as you said, and he kept me on because he felt continuity on the Middle East was important. One of my first discussions with him, he was very personal and asked me whether his being Jewish would be a major factor in the Middle East. And I said I really didn't think so. I thought some of our intelligence reports had suggested from conversations among Arabs that they thought that might be an advantage, that maybe he would have a way of dealing with the Israelis that would be more persuasive. Anyway, we had that conversation, but I think he was still uncertain about his base. As Bill said, he was much more preoccupied with Soviets and Vietnam. And I think there was a difference, since we need to get into Nixon here. I've reflected on what President Nixon brought to the presidency in the way of exposure to this area. You have to remember, he was vice president during the Aswan Dam crisis with Egypt in the 1950s when he was vice president. Bill quotes a wonderful letter from Nixon to the Secretary of State when the 1967 war broke out, advising him to think about the Soviet role in the war and so on. So Nixon came to this with some sensitivity to the dynamics of regional conflicts, local conflicts. At the same time, as we all know, he had a preoccupation with wanting to change the interactions among the major powers, to change the way the great power role in the world was played. Henry had the second, but not the first. So I think the second reason for his not wanting to plunge in here was that he really didn't have personal experience with the Middle East conflict. So I think standing back was his way of doing that. I don't think he was ready to assert himself.
It's interesting. The Rogers Plan fails. The war of attrition heats up during the course of 1970. The Israelis begin, after heavier bombardments, they build the Bar-Lev line, heavy bombardments. The Israelis decide to react to heavy bombardments, which the Egyptians are doing primarily to raise the cost of them of being there, by not only bombing the cities along the Suez Canal, but then doing deep penetration raids into Egypt and basically bombing the outskirts of Cairo. Nasser begins to panic over this, and he invites thousands of Soviets into Egypt. Large numbers of SAM sites, large numbers of Soviet personnel, and increasingly Soviet pilots as well. Eventually, you end up with dogfights between the Israeli and Soviet pilots. Tremendous potential for escalation at this point. In June of 1970, again, Rogers in the lead, Rogers launches an initiative to try to bring this escalation, to try to control it. Eventually, it leads on August 7th, 1970, to a ceasefire. Nixon writes about that, and he says this was a great accomplishment for Rogers, a great accomplishment for Joe Sisko. But he also says, even though the Egyptians and the Soviets violate before the ink, he says, before the ink is dry on the agreement, the Egyptians have violated this. The fact is, it basically holds. The Israelis are persuaded not to do anything. I want to turn to you, Sam. Even though you weren't, again, involved at this period, you know the Israelis in your succeeding incarnations. When they look back on the Nixon period, how much are they influenced by simply the behavior of what goes on in 73 and afterwards, which we will get to? How much is there a kind of totality of the Nixon administration and its approaches, including the earlier periods? Nixon in March of 1970 actually postpones a sale of Phantom jets. He persuades them not to overreact to the violations of the ceasefire. Is there a residue of that in the succeeding years when you talk to Israelis, or do they focus on a different part of the Nixon years?
Well, I think they all recall very admiringly Nixon's style in dealing with them and with the region. They saw him as a pretty smart guy in handling the Russians. And the Russian relationship with them is also very crucial. You didn't hear much about it in later years. I think they're more influenced by Henry's shuttles and the impression that those made on him, which we'll talk about further. But up to the point of 1977, when Menachem Begin took office and his total turnover in political leadership in Israel, up to that point, the political leaders had all known Nixon, Ford, and Henry Kissinger to be strong and effective when they chose to intercede, either to stop something or to start something. Mm-hmm. And I think that did play a role in the thinking of the Labor Party leaders, who unfortunately left power at the time Begin took power.
When shortly after the ceasefire holds, as I said earlier, we have something called Black September, where radical Palestinian groups hijack airplanes into Jordan. This kind of pushes the king to decide that enough of a state within a state, and he cracks down and basically devastates the PLO and forces them to leave. In the midst of this, you have the Syrians threatening to intervene and actually end up sending tanks across the border. I want to talk to Dick Murphy in a second about the Syrian perspective on this, but I want to ask you, Hal, this is a crisis, a real crisis at the time, and how does the president look at it?
Well, in one sentence, I can remember standing in a group somewhere in the White House where he was the center, and his saying, in effect, that this was the most dangerous situation that he had faced. And he was even reflecting on the key decision that he had to make during the crisis, and saying he still was not sure exactly why he made the decision that he made. In other words, it was traumatic moment for him. And the situation was this: following the outbreak of the crisis, King Hussein of Jordan was in touch with the White House, asking for military support to blunt these Syrian tank columns that had moved into northern Jordan. And the question came up, well, the United States did really not have the massive military presence in the eastern Mediterranean that would have been required, certainly for intervention of ground troops, but even were limited in the number of air sorties that could be run from the carriers that were moved to the eastern Mediterranean. So the question came up, should we ask the Israelis for air attacks, or maybe even ground troops, which would have been obviously a very, very sensitive thing for Israelis to move in support of an Arab leader against another Arab leader. Anyway, we were back and forth on that. It was, should Nixon authorize the Israelis to do air attacks? The Jordanians said, well, please don't send ground troops into Jordan, but maybe you should move them into Syria. Anyway, it was a very, very complex period of about 48 hours. And ultimately, the administration was saved from making any of those decisions because King Hussein ordered his air force to attack the Syrian tanks, which they did quite successfully. And for reasons of domestic politics in Syria, the Syrians did not send their air force in to back the tanks. And so the tanks withdrew, and it was all over, and none of the difficult decisions actually had to be made. But in a way, there were decisions made along the way that could have launched an Israeli attack and so on. So I think that was, I think Nixon was much relieved, but also I think rather pleased at the way his own personal thought processes and decision-making processes.
Well, I think also, certainly, the Israelis have always believed that certain moves that they made to threaten moving their air force against the Syrian tanks played a significant role as well.
I think that
And they did that knowing that Nixon wouldn't
wanted them to.
necessarily be unhappy.
No, we
Yeah.
wanted them to.
Yeah.
yeah, and I think the bottom line is one that Bill describes in his book, and that is that the decisions that were made, the moves that were made, and so on, gave King Hussein enough confidence that
Yeah.
he could send his air force
Right.
against, and if he got into trouble, to use Bill's words, there would be
Somebody would come
somebody to
and
come
help.
in and help
He'd be
him out.
bailed out. But now the interesting thing here, you said due to domestic Syrian politics, the Air Force isn't committed. Dick, what's going on in Syria at this time? And why does Assad make the decision he does? And does the decisions he makes at this time, I mean, obviously he comes to power, he's the head of the Air Force at the time, he comes to power later, but is there some impact in his later decisions from this set of decisions that he makes at this juncture?
Well, I'd like to suggest that this shows the basic caution that dominated Assad in his foreign policy, his military decisions. It didn't hurt in terms of domestic politics that he saved the Air Force from getting shot down over Jordan. And it showed up perhaps the recklessness of some Syrian military figures who were sending tanks in. I don't know that firsthand, but I think caution was the watchword for Hafez al-Assad. He showed that 5 years later when the question came up of how and should he enter Lebanon, should he send forces to help the Lebanese army, and he was very careful to watch the limits that we had laid down, relayed from the Israelis at that point in time. So I think it was typical of Assad. There was great disdain for King Hussein and Jordan, the puppet of England, the creation of England, the puppet of America and Western imperialism. And that goes back, I saw that in the early 60s in Syria, and it continued. But then when King Hussein showed he could do something militarily, effectively, himself, plus the threats from Israel, from the United States possibly getting involved, it was quite an easy decision to get back out.
So I want to, this has been an important preamble, I think. I mean, the period that is most well known and the impact that it has on future peacemaking clearly comes after the war. I want us to get into the 73 war and be able to discuss it and all of the various elements of it at some length. Bill, I'm going to turn to you. It's clear that when 73 comes, it comes as a great surprise to us, as a great surprise to the Israelis. I wonder if you might get into why it is such a surprise to both of us, and spend some time also getting in and describing the kind of what evolves during the course of the war. We clearly have a set of expectations. If you would describe the President's calculus at the beginning of the war and the expectations. We know during the course of the first week of the war, as an example, that the Israelis lose something like 500 tanks, they lose 49 aircraft, they're desperate for resupply. We hold on the resupply. If you'd go through this whole dynamic, the calculus and what unfolds, and then the turning points, the various turning points of the war, we want to get into as well how close we were to a real confrontation with the Soviets, but that's enough to sort of launch a discussion on.
More than enough. Yeah. In the early part of 1973, a number of interesting things happened, and Hal was involved in some of them. We actually did begin a political dialogue with the Egyptians. And Kissinger, in that dialogue, said, we'll get to the Middle East issue, but toward the end of the year. You know, the Israelis have elections coming up, and you know, we're not ready, in the sense we were still wrapping up odds and ends from Vietnam. So there was a kind of a commitment that we'll get to your issues, but not right away. Mm-hmm. And I think as time went on, the Egyptians got more and more frustrated that they couldn't somehow get our attention. So two things happened. In the spring of '73, not October, there is a very real-looking crisis that starts mobilization on the Egyptian and Syrian fronts, and the Israelis take it seriously and mobilize. And the whole thing goes away. But at the time, it looked like it was moving toward war. So when the same things start happening again in late September, early October, we look at them and we say, well, they're going through exercises. And the Israelis said, yeah, we're not particularly nervous. We've seen this before. What we now know, I can't give you much detail on it, is the Israelis had a very high-level penetration in the Egyptian government. He happened, interestingly, to be the son-in-law of former President Nasser. And they were expecting that if this was real, they would hear from him, which they did on October 5th. And he tells them it's going to be tomorrow at the end of the day. Based on that, they do their own assessment of what's going on, and they conclude that's right, it's going to be the next day. So October 5th is a day when they become aware that war is about to happen. We're watching all the technical things happening, and it's looking very serious. Actually, Kissinger's up in New York talking to the Egyptians. Nixon is in Florida listening to his tapes to see how bad it's really going to be if they all come out. And all of a sudden, for tragic reasons involving my good friend and colleague here, he is not able to take charge of the office that day. So I all of a sudden take charge of the office and say, as I leave, if anything happens overnight, call me, because it will mean a war is going to start in the Middle East. And the next morning at 6 in the morning, my phone rings, and I remember awakening and saying, oh my God, it's for real, and it's going to be on my watch. So I went in to the office at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and shortly thereafter, the war in the Middle East began. So we were caught by surprise. Not that we didn't see all the signs that it could happen, but we didn't know that it would. And the prevailing view, I think, from the president on down was the Arabs don't have the military clout or potential to attack Israel without getting totally clobbered in return. We had a very, very high regard for Israeli military power, based on, for good reasons, on their performance in the 1967 war. And I still remember that when Kissinger came down from New York on that first day, October 6th, he was furious. He said, "Why didn't the Egyptians listen to me? I said I was going to get to this. They're crazy. The Israelis will be in Cairo tomorrow, and they will, I can't understand why this madman, Sadat, did this." Well, he thought the war would be over in 48 hours with a glamorous Israeli victory, but it wasn't supposed to happen this way. The other thing that's important from that very first few hours is I have the transcript of a phone conversation, the first one between Kissinger and Nixon. These are all published in something called the Foreign Relations of the United States. The 1973 war volume has just come out. It's probably the best documented foreign affairs crisis that we have now, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on that first day, Kissinger and the president are talking, and they're speculating about why did the war happen, who started it. We didn't even know who actually fired the first shots. And the president weighs in. Remember, he's down in Florida, and he says to Kissinger, "Don't take sides." His first advice to him is, "Don't take sides." In other words, we're going to sort of not immediately prejudge who even started the war. And so the early moment is Kissinger being sort of angry that this has happened, with an expectation that the Israelis will win very, very quickly without any need for us to intervene. Now, the next day, a very important development takes place that begins to change Kissinger's view of Sadat. He had never met Sadat, the Egyptian president. He gets a back-channel message, that is a message that doesn't go to the State Department, just goes straight to the White House from Sadat through his national security advisor. And he basically says, "I want you to know why I did this, why we started the war. It's not to defeat Israel. It's because the status quo was intolerable and we could not get you to do anything through gentle persuasion. We needed to do something dramatic. But I want you to know that as much as we will be on opposite sides during the war, when the war is over, we want to work with the United States to solve this once and for all." And I am convinced from seeing Henry Kissinger Day 1 and Henry Kissinger Day 3 that from that moment on, he started thinking about the end game. How do we want this to end? Given that maybe there's a chance that Sadat is somebody we can do diplomacy with. He'd done diplomacy with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Vietnamese. He wasn't looking for an angel. He was looking for somebody who was pragmatic, hard-headed, rational, and could deliver. And so very early on, Kissinger expresses a judgment, and this is like the third day, before the Soviets have started airlifting arms to Israel, but at a time when Israel's, to Egypt, sorry, and to Syria. But the Israelis are getting very nervous at this time because they've taken the heavy losses that Dennis mentions, but we're not yet at the point of immediately responding on a large scale. And Kissinger expresses the view of how this should end. He says the best scenario would be for Israel to push the Egyptians back across the canal, but that would entail severe losses. It would be a big battle, so they probably won't do it. He said, and we don't want an Arab debacle. That's the second sentence. We don't want the Israelis to lose, but we also don't want an Arab debacle. And then he goes on, and in one sentence, he capsulizes his then state of mind. He says, my assessment is a costly victory for Israel without a disaster is the best. That is, no disaster on the Arab side. Israelis should win, but it should cost them something. It shouldn't be easy. And I don't want to see a debacle, a total defeat on the other side. So from that point on, there is an attempt to ensure that this will end in a way that the diplomacy can take off fairly quickly thereafter. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer, but the Israeli request for arms becomes a very big and a very controversial part of what happens. And Kissinger's view in his memoirs is that once the Soviets started putting arms into Egypt and Syria, which they did on October 10th, it was a short delay before we started. The delay, he claims, was largely caused by bureaucratic incompetence at the Pentagon. This is not true. Although there, of course, in any big operation, there's some bureaucratic incompetence. What is true is that there was a very concerted effort on October 11th and 12th to get a ceasefire in place, at which point Kissinger's view was if the war is about to end anyway, it's better for us not to launch a big airlift into Israel with all the implications that would have for how we would be perceived on the Arab side. The war is going to be over in a day or two. And it was based on conversations with the Soviets about a ceasefire. They said they would support it, we would support it, but it didn't work. The initiative failed, and it failed on the 13th of October. On the 13th, Kissinger goes to Nixon, and he says to him that the Russians are showing no restraint. The ceasefire that we thought we could get is not going to go into effect. And so he says to Nixon, we've got to now respond. And Nixon, interestingly, he doesn't have much to say between the beginning of the war and this moment. But on the airlift, he says, as I say, it's got to be the works. That is, we've got to send them a lot. What I mean is, we're going to get blamed just as much for sending them 3 planes as for 300. This is a deadly course, I know, that is the airlift to Israel. But what I mean, Henry, is I have no patience with the view that we send in a couple of planes, even though they carry so many tons and so forth. So Nixon says, let's do the airlift and let's do it big. And that's the beginning of about a 10-day period where every day the American planes are flying, carrying ammunition, spare parts, in a few cases tanks, some planes are being flown in. In fact, it doesn't turn the tide of the battle. That's already been turned, but it changes the psychology for the Israelis. It also probably triggers the Arab oil embargo, although that may well have happened anyway. But it's a very sensitive moment. The relationship between the diplomacy and the arms resupply is quite crucial. And at that point, Kissinger's view is the Israelis can now mount a major offensive that is going to force Sadat to recalculate. And they do. They cross the canal. They start approaching Cairo. They don't get within more than 60 miles of it, but at which point they basically stop. And it's the Russians who finally convince the Egyptians that it's time to stop the war. Otherwise, it is going to be the debacle. And at that point, they invite Kissinger to come to Moscow to negotiate the terms of a ceasefire, which he does, partly as a delaying tactic. He could have easily talked to Dobrynin in Washington, but he chooses to go to Moscow. He tells the Israelis he's going, and he basically says, this is coming to an end soon. He negotiates for about 24, 36 hours in Moscow. I didn't go on that trip. Hal didn't go on it. But it was dealt with in the US-Soviet context. They reach an agreement. It's called UN Resolution 338. And on the way back to Washington, Kissinger stops in Israel to see Golda Meir, who is not very happy about the UN Resolution 338 because Israel is on the verge of encircling the 3rd Egyptian Army and capturing them or starving them out. So he arrives with considerable animosity being expressed toward the policy that he's just announced to them, that it's time to stop ceasefire in place, which is supposed to go into effect almost immediately. So the Israelis complain, say, standstill ceasefires don't work, and they refer back to August 1970. So we're not so sure that what it even means to have a standstill ceasefire. So Kissinger says to them, actually I'll quote from Golda Meir. This is on when she's talking to Kissinger in Tel Aviv. We would have been in a much better position if we'd had a few more days, but we can't do that now. We've had a trauma about standstill ceasefires from our August 1970 experience. And then Kissinger tries to explain that he had tried to send a message from Moscow to the Israelis saying that you don't actually have to stop immediately. We'll give you a little bit more time. And they say, well, the message never got through. So Kissinger then says, and this is something I don't think he later on would necessarily want revealed, but it's in the transcripts. He says, you won't get violent mind you, the ceasefire was supposed to have gone into effect at this point. Right. Kissinger says, you won't get violent protests from Washington if something happens during the night while I'm flying. In other words, I've got about a 7-hour flight to get home. If you guys use that time to improve your position on the ground, you won't get a big complaint from me. So nothing can happen in Washington until noon tomorrow. In other words, when I get back. The president's not doing anything at this point, but when I get back, then you've got to have stopped by then. And the prime minister says, but if they don't stop, we won't. And Kissinger says, even if they do, you won't. So this is called the little wink to the Israelis that go ahead and violate the ceasefire, but not too much. By the time he gets back, they have violated it. They're on the verge of finishing off the Third Army. Sadat is in full panic mode because his grand strategy is about to collapse, and he appeals to the United States and to the Soviet Union to intervene to enforce UN Resolution 338 and the ceasefire. And the Soviets come to us and say, that's a good idea, let's do it. And Kissinger says, no deal. You don't intervene, and we don't intervene. It's the moment this becomes a US-Soviet competitive intervention, it changes everything. So don't even think about it. You know, we'll talk to the Israelis, and he gets actually quite annoyed at the Israelis and said, now you've got to stop. And you have to allow water and food through to the Egyptian army, and if you don't, we'll force you to. He actually gets quite angry at the Israelis. 24 hours earlier, he was urging them to do all this. Yeah. It's crazy, but this is the real world. At that point, Brezhnev sends a message and said, if you're not prepared to do anything, we will consider taking all measures, including military. And that message comes in the evening of October 24th, I think it is. Yeah. Yeah. And in the absence of the president, the National Security Council meets and calls for a stage 3 nuclear alert. The assumption that the Soviets will notice that we're concerned about their threat. And most Americans had no idea when they went to bed that night what this meant, but a stage 3 nuclear alert means that everybody in the military is told to go basically to battle stations. Get ready. If you're a pilot, you get in your B-52 and get ready to either take off, and the nuclear weapons are on board. This is like getting ready for nuclear war. It's not imminent, but it's serious. So by the next morning, Americans all over the country were aware that something huge was underway. We hadn't made any public announcement of it. And very quickly, the crisis winds down, but not without the next morning, 25th, my last memory, and then I promise I'll stop, is we did receive a small fragment of intelligence from a communication from Moscow to their embassy in Cairo. And it said, troops arrive this afternoon. And Kissinger is told this, and he says, oh my gosh, they're going in. And he turns to me and to Roy Atherton, who happened to be there. He says, you guys figure out where we send our troops in the Middle East if they send theirs. Because if they're going in, we also have to go in, but not to Israel. Find someplace other than Israel where we will send our troops, and then we'll have some bargaining leverage. They take theirs out, we take ours out. It was a hair-raising moment because we could not figure out where those troops might go. And very quickly we discovered, as sometimes you do with intelligence, that it was a fragment of a larger message that said 32 uniformed military observers will be arriving in Cairo to observe the ceasefire, which we had agreed to, and we were supposed to send them as well. And that's all it was. And then the crisis ended. And Kissinger's last words on the crisis, and this was a pretty nerve-wracking few days, was we Americans, are now in the catbird seat. I didn't even know what that meant at the time, but it's a good place to be. It means you dominate the scene. And he was ready at that point to move from crisis management to diplomacy.
Thank you. that sets the stage for us to discuss the diplomacy and how you were on these trips. You were with him, helping to shape what would be done. Can you give us a sense of the first meeting that he has with Sadat? I mean, Bill has described how his view of Sadat has basically changed. We'd like to hear about sort of the impact of that meeting, but then get more into the beginnings of the diplomacy, the kind of logic that he had in mind, what he was trying to do with it, and what the direction was going to be.
I think it's worth just injecting one word of background here. Among the things that were done around the time after the war of attrition ended and so on, there was a brief period in there when the State Department was authorized to pursue with Sadat and with the Israelis the idea of what we called an interim settlement around the Suez Canal. In other words, there was a move from the idea of the Rogers Plan, which is a package deal dealing with all issues at once. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister of Israel, had suggested the possibility of a deal to open the canal.
Right.
Troops pull back from both sides and so on. That didn't materialize at the time, but it was picked up now. And this was in the back of Kissinger's mind, moving from the big package deal to interim steps. So when Kissinger met for the first time with Sadat on a trip that Bill has mentioned, but took place in October 1973. At that time, Israeli troops had gone beyond the ceasefire lines that should have followed from Resolution 338. And Sadat, in this meeting where he and Kissinger were alone, according to Kissinger afterward, asked Kissinger to press the Israelis to go back to what were called the lines of October 22nd, that is the formal ceasefire lines. They'd well exceeded that in Egyptian territory. And Kissinger, according to his report after the meeting, says he told Sadat that for me, or us, the United States, to get the Israelis to move back to the ceasefire lines would cost us as much political capital. I mean, we would be seen to be pressing the Israelis, being seen by the American political community to be pressing the Israelis unduly. And he said, for me to do that would cost as much political capital as it would if you would give me 2 months to arrange the political scene in Washington for an agreement that would get the Israelis back across the canal and have a much bigger withdrawal, which we could then portray as the first step toward an overall settlement. But that was his formulation, as I remember his reporting it. I need time to get the Congress behind us, to get the various parts of the administration behind us, and so on. So that was there was then a holding pattern.
And Sadat accepts that
Yes,
proposal, which impresses Kissinger.
That's right. Yeah.
Because he'd expected haggling, and all of a sudden Sadat says, fine,
Do it. Yeah.
we'll do it.
Yeah. And then the next thing that happened was, again, back to the Soviet side of all this, there was an agreement to try to arrange a conference on the Middle East in Geneva, which was to take place in December. And so the second chapter in this saga, once is this private agreement to do an interim deal 2 months, 3 months hence, but then the Soviets had to be placated by holding this conference in Geneva. The conference was sponsored by the United Nations, and indeed chaired by the United Nations, and the Soviets and the Americans were sort of co-chairs or some sort of symbolic thing like that. Well, that required a couple of more Kissinger trips to the Middle East between October and December to arrange this and to get all of the Middle Eastern parties lined up. And they all came, including Palestinian representatives, and that was another problem. How do you arrange them? Who will have their pictures taken sitting next to the Palestinians? Israelis won't. We're not supposed to. And so how do you work that out? That was a minor detail. But the a little piece of drama and amusement in the middle, we went to see President Assad in Damascus, and Kissinger presented him with the invitation to this conference in Geneva, because everybody, of course, had to agree to the terms of reference for the conference before it happened. And Assad, it was read to him, translated from English into Arabic. It was read to him, and Assad listened very, very carefully, very thoughtfully. And then he said to Kissinger, "Mr. Secretary, this is a very good letter. I agree to everything except the last sentence." The last sentence was acceptance to come. He said, "I won't be there." So we held the conference without Syria. But that was the formal step. Then in January, having in mind the proposal Kissinger made to Sadat and Sadat's acceptance of it, we flew to Cairo with a draft of an agreement in our briefcases that that proposed Israeli pullback across the canal, Egyptian forces moving forward to a certain point, and then there were lines drawn that would create a buffer around the canal and so on. Sadat looked at this and said to Kissinger, "This is perfect, Henry. I want you to stay in the Middle East until the Israelis will sign it." So the shuttle diplomacy of the next 2 years wasn't something that was formally designed as such, but it came out of that moment. And we did stay for 10 days more, and lo and behold, we actually got the Israelis to agree to this, and that was the first we called the disengagement agreement. That was really the ostensible purpose of it, to pull the troops apart so that some patrol in the middle of the night wouldn't bump into another one in the desert and reignite the whole conflict. So that was the first agreement, interim agreement. Sadat preferred another term for it, but that was the beginning of shuttle diplomacy. And it was accomplished by, the reason for the word shuttle was that we based ourselves in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. We went from Sadat to Jerusalem, talked to the Israelis about this, and they accepted the idea, anyway, of trying this. And it was really not much more than the interim agreement around the canal to open the canal that the State Department had tried before that. So we went back to Israel and then got their suggestions and so on, and flew back to Aswan in Egypt, where Sadat had his winter residence. And we'd fly back to Israel and back and forth. And we had a dozen journalists on the back of our airplane, and they started calling this the shuttle, since after the New York to Washington shuttle here. And I've forgotten how many round trips there were. It was about 14 days, so there was probably at least 10 or 12 round trips. And then came down to the point where we had everything agreed except for, I think it was a number of artillery pieces that could be in a certain place. And Kissinger got Sadat's tentative agreement, but he had to go back to Israel to get agreement there. He left me behind in Aswan with our ambassador to Egypt so that we could get word that the Israelis had agreed to the final number. Then we would take it to Sadat, and that would be it. Well, we were sitting in our hotel room in Aswan waiting for this response, and from Israel, from Tel Aviv. It didn't come, it didn't come, it didn't come. And the only way we could talk to them, we didn't have embassy communications facilities in Aswan, so we had to do this by telephone, but there was no telephone link between Egypt and Israel at the time. So we had to be on the phone with the Operations Center in the State Department in Washington, and they with the Secretary's party in Israel. The ambassador and I sat there waiting for this telephone call, and finally we got a message. And you know, this is act of God and all the things that can happen in this complicated situation. It has snowed in Jerusalem, and the cabinet has not been able to gather. So that finally was overcome, and we got the final numbers. And the next day, the legal advisor of the State Department had flown over with the signing copies, and he and I went to a tent in the desert, kilometer 101 between Cairo and Suez, which was a UN tent, and the agreement was signed, and that was the first disengagement agreement.
Signed by the generals, not by the political leaders.
That's right. Yeah. Agreed by the political authorities, but signed by the generals.
Yeah, I want to. There's a disengagement between there's a shuttle of 32 days, I think, to produce a disengagement.
36,
between,
actually.
36, sorry, as you were saying, who was counting? But
I was counting.
You were
It's
counting.
the only time in my life I've ever asked whether I could stay on my feet. 26 round trips between Tel Aviv and.
So you actually were
Assad.
counting. But
You're darn right.
I want to discuss that shuttle as well, and talk to Dick about the impact of that on Assad. I know it had a big impact on Rabin because I saw it years later when I was dealing with Rabin, when we were trying to deal with a commitment, a pocket commitment he gave to us on a readiness during the Clinton administration to withdraw from the Golan Heights. And that shuttle heavily affected his view of Assad and his pragmatism. I want to get to that in a second, though, because one thing that was raised, and I'd like to get both you and Bill to comment on it, the role of the Soviets. Now here, the Soviets have been cut out. If you go back to at least the concept of the Rogers Plan, the Soviets were basically being cut in. In the end, they don't go for it because they can't get Nasser to agree to it. But the concept was a kind of almost condominium approach. And it sounds as if the Kissinger approach is to keep the Soviets out, but that Nixon, in his mind, given his concept of how detente might work, he might have been more open to that. Now, is this one potential area where there was actually a kind of dissonance in terms of the Nixon view and the Kissinger view, or am I reading too much into this?
I can only say I never sensed it. And we spent a lot of time, as you just said. And I would think I would have gotten some sort of snide remarks or something or other from Kissinger if there had been a disagreement. You have to remember, at that point, President Nixon was very much preoccupied with domestic problems around Watergate. But I think the Soviet part of that shuttle is kind of interesting because it revealed to us how Assad, who was getting his arms and everything from the Soviets, supposedly Syria supporters, and one day Gromyko, Soviet foreign minister, had arrived in Damascus while we were meeting with Assad as part of this negotiation. And Assad said, well, are you going to stop by the guest house and say hello to Gromyko? And Kissinger said, no, I'm just going to drive by. And Assad was gleeful. He just thought it was the greatest thing that Kissinger was going to snub Gromyko. The relationship there was not all that close at that point.
I don't really want to ask what-if questions, but as long as we have this forum, I'm going to do it anyway. Bill, if there hadn't been the Nixon preoccupation with Watergate, do you think that his view on Middle East diplomacy might have been different in terms of the Soviet role or not?
I think it is true that during October and through the disengagement negotiations, Kissinger was fundamentally in charge. He would get broad lines of guidance from the president. And I do think that Nixon's view was a little bit different from his, including on the Soviet Union and on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. If you'll indulge me, I'll read
Please.
one more excerpt. This is Nixon on October 12th. This is just before the decision on the airlift. And he's reflecting on a very important event that had happened the previous summer. He had met with Brezhnev at a summit meeting in San Clemente, and Brezhnev had said, he'd asked for a special meeting late at night. He said, we need to ward off a war that's coming in the Middle East. And he basically tells the Americans that unless something is done, there is going to be an Arab-Israeli war, which was true.
Yeah.
But he didn't, of course, say, and it's going to be on October 6th, and it's going to happen exactly this way. But we kind of brush it off. We don't take it all that seriously. Nixon, in the midst of the war, says this to Kissinger in a phone conversation. He says, I think we've got to get some way. Look, we've got to face this. As far as the Russians are concerned, they have a pretty good beef insofar as everything we've offered on the Mideast. You know what I mean, that meeting in San Clemente. We were stringing them along, and they know it. We've got to come off with something on the diplomatic front, because if we go for a ceasefire, they'll figure that we will get the ceasefire, then the Israelis will dig in and we'll back them, as we always have. That's putting it quite bluntly, but you know it's true, Henry. And he says, well, there's a lot to that. Nixon says, they can't be in that position, so we've got to be in a position to offer something. That is, we can't expect the Soviets to support a ceasefire if it means the Israelis are just going to dig in and nothing follows. So we've got to make sure that something will follow on the ceasefire. Kissinger says, well, Nixon says, because we've got to squeeze the Israelis when this is over, and the Russians have got to know it. We've got to squeeze them goddamn hard, and that's the way it's going to be done. But I don't know how we can get across now, in the midst of the war. We told them before we'd squeeze them, and we didn't. Kissinger says, well, we were going to squeeze them. We were going to start diplomacy in November, right after the Israeli elections. It's an interesting little vignette of Nixon wanting to lean forward and being a little sensitive to the Soviets have a grievance, that we've strung them along. Now, whether it would have played out very differently, I don't know. But my sense is that detente meant more to Nixon than it did to Kissinger.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about this, the disengagement with Syria. Hal, why don't you give us, again, some of your observations on that? And then, Dick, I would like to hear from you on the impact of that on Assad, his perception of us, maybe his perception of Rabin, because as I will tell you that what I said before about that disengagement process had a big impact on Rabin's perception of Assad. But I can also tell you, based on a lot of time I spent with Assad, first with Baker and then in direct negotiations with him in the 90s, it also had a perception on him of Rabin. Indeed, I was with Assad 10 days after the Rabin assassination, and he said to me explicitly that you may think people were rejoicing here when that happened. We were not. And he said I had a lot of respect for him. So, that respect came from perhaps different periods, but I have a suspicion that this disengagement process, as difficult as it was, obviously 36 days, nonetheless, it was a formative experience on both leaders. And I'd like to hear from you, but then also from you, Dick.
Let me begin by saying a word about how Henry conducted these meetings, whether it was between Israel and Egypt or Israel and Syria. He would sit down with, whether it was Sadat or Assad, in this case, Assad, and the first half hour of the meeting, and the meetings with Assad were usually about 6 hours or more. Anyway, the first half hour, Henry would talk about the Israeli negotiating team, individual by individual. If there was some proposal that was then being negotiated, Henry would say, well, so-and-so took this position, and so-and-so asked about this, and so-and-so. In an interesting way, today we might use the word virtual negotiation, but he was really introducing the people on each side to the people on the other side to the point where it would come down to the fact, well, I suppose Diane won't like this, but, you know, so it was an interesting experience in mediation. And therefore, I think Assad, come back to your point, would have gotten a very good feel of people on the other side. And of course, the negotiation was tough. As I say, 36 days back and forth. And Assad was a very tough negotiator. And yet you had the sense that there were serious people having a debate about how to resolve serious issues. And I mean, just one little humorous vignette. The final day, when Assad said, well, okay, we agree. Kissinger and Assad were walking out of Assad's huge conference room side by side, and Kissinger said through an interpreter, you know, I've negotiated with a lot of people in my life. Some people walk up to the brink and look over and step back. You're the only one I've ever met that walks up to the brink, goes over, and hopes he'll catch a limb on the way down.
Dick, you spent a lot of time with Assad, and
Many hours. First of all, I don't think Kissinger was ever able to go back to the Israelis and say, I sensed this difference within Damascus between General Shahabi and the foreign minister and the president. There was one view, and it was the president's how to do it. What he was negotiating all that time was to get the Israelis back to where they had been before the war. No, not further, not moving deeper into the Golan Heights. And yes, Assad was hard as nails, as Kissinger himself said. I got to know every damn rock and bush on the Golan Heights by the time we were finished. That left Assad certainly with respect for the American effort and a hope that this was just the first bite. And I have never been able to discover when we decided we weren't going again for a further disengagement talk with Syria. I thought it was an ongoing, it was a likely process. It would continue. And I think Assad felt that for at least 2 or 3 years after he had the first disengagement. But American attention was focused on Sadat. He was eager. Assad was far from eager. He was very careful, very slow. And the Israelis presented their position that they couldn't be expected to negotiate on more than one front at a time. And I guess we, or those of you back home, accepted that. His view, or rather the local comment I picked up when I called on the Soviet ambassador, I got there in August of '74, paid my first courtesy call on him. He was the dean of the diplomatic corps, rather tired, having been several years in Damascus. And he said, welcome. I'm glad that your relations have been resumed with Syria. Let me just share with you one fact. You have come here thinking this is a Soviet client state. Well, it's true. It's true that Syria accepts everything from Moscow except advice. And that was, to me, a lesson I've carried over the years, and I still think of it today as we continue the fight with the Soviets' descendants over Syria.
can I ask you, I want to...
Can I ask him a question?
Please.
I'm curious
never-
about
you never
what you said, Dick, about Assad's purpose was always to get the Israelis just back to where they had been before the war. That was where he came out.
In the first.
In the first
Yeah,
disengagement. That implies the argument that he had lost that territory after having invaded. Never made any impact on him. He didn't feel any sense of defeat out of the war. If you want to go right back to where you were before, regardless of the fact that you invaded a country and then lost some territory in the process. Was that his psyche? That didn't count.
Well, I think he and Sadat at one point, certainly before the war, shared the view this was going to be a political war, and we were going to get the attention of the world, and particularly of Washington, and get back all of the land back to where it had been before the Six-Day War, for all of us.
Yeah.
And Sadat committed treason. Sadat betrayed us. He betrayed the Arabs, because the only way we would have gotten to that point was to have Arab unity maintained throughout in its talks with Israel.
Yeah, okay. Right.
Just technically, he did make a slight gain. He got Kuneitra.
Yeah,
The
he did.
one major Arab city on the Golan Heights had been on
Right.
under Israeli control from 1967 on, and he got Kuneitra back. And that a lot of the negotiating was
about
precisely about
Yeah.
Kuneitra, and that would be inside a demilitarized zone and so forth. So
Yeah.
symbolically, he got that much.
Yeah.
And it was symbolic. If you had, we flew up
Yeah.
on a helicopter to Golan Heights to see where the lines might be drawn during the negotiation. And Kuneitra was I don't want to say anything disparaging about anything, but it wasn't very much of a town, and there wasn't very much of it left. It was a symbolic bit of territory.
The signs were posted all over Kuneitra for years to come about how civilization had triumphed and evil had been pushed back. And here are the open tombs that the Israelis desecrated, looking for weapons in the tombs. And all of that was part of the picture.
Just one little
And the
vignette
museum
of
there.
kind of thing that can go on in a shuttle like this, because the Israelis were trying not to move that line through Kuneitra, all 300 yards of it or whatever it was. At the Israeli end of these negotiations, Kissinger would say, well, give me a map and show me where you want the line so we can talk about it. Well, we don't have a map. And for several days, they didn't have a map. Well,
They don't like to
one
give
of the things you
maps.
learn as a mediator is that you're peculiarly naked. 'Cause we never controlled that territory. We never set foot on it before. But we did have satellite photography. And so finally, about the fourth day, when the Israelis refused to give Henry a map, he turned to me and put his hand out. So I pulled out the aerial photograph from my briefcase, and he said, okay, we have a map. So it's just an example of how knowledge is power, and if you can generate that kind of knowledge as a mediator, you've got a lot going for you. And that's what the United States of America has the capacity to do, and I don't think many other governments in the world can do that.
Absolutely. Nixon does go to the Middle East. He stops in Egypt. I know there's a clip that they started to run a little bit before. Do you want to run that clip now of Walter Cronkite?
Evening. President Nixon came to Egypt today to a very warm welcome from President Anwar Sadat back there on the balcony of the official guest house, Kuba Palace. But perhaps the more important reception for the president was in the streets of Cairo. Egyptian security authorities estimated there were 2 million people along the 7-mile route of the motorcade that brought the presidents of the United States and Egypt in from the airport. Buses and trucks had brought many of them from their factory jobs, but whether they were recruited or not, there seemed to be no mistaking the genuineness of their welcome. They said it was the greatest crowd here since the funeral of Gamal Nasser. As that sad occasion marked the end of one era, this one seemed to be a celebration of the beginning of a new Egyptian era, as much as a welcome for the man they clearly credit with making it possible. One of the many signs said it. The Egyptians of October 73 hail Nixon. That's the significance of this trip for the Arab world, a cachet from the President of the United States. Here they consider themselves victor in that October war, and they see this presidential visit as the seal on that victory. From some of us older correspondents who once were cheered down the avenues of Europe as American liberators, this was the refreshment of a memory and a strange and wonderful feeling to once again hear cheers for America as the peacemaker. But this trip was contrived, as some have suggested, primarily for domestic political purposes. It still must have been heady stuff for a president under siege at home, and it may redouble his determination to make stick the temporary peace his Secretary of State has forged. Man of honor, man of peace, the sign said. You have our confidence, American understanding, American friendship.
The two presidents of Egypt and the United States meeting together, we cement the foundations of a new relationship between two great peoples who will dedicate themselves in the future to working together for great causes.
Sam, I want to turn to you because I want to sort of use that as a point of departure. Whatever the purposes of the trip, it's interesting that as Walter Cronkite says, here's an image that the U.S. is in there now as a peacemaker. Our discussion so far, I think, has focused a lot about the launching of a process. This was a process that Kissinger became uniquely identified with, how you laid out sort of the genesis of it. Historically, it's been looked back on and described as a kind of incremental approach to peacemaking, not a kind of comprehensive approach to peacemaking, step-by-step approach to peacemaking. Yeah. There can be alternative models in terms of approaches to peace, step-by-step versus peacemaking, versus the more comprehensive. When you take a look at this now, I mean, what do you make of it? How do you think of these respective models? Do you think the models are pretty much dependent upon the circumstances, or do you think there's one that's superior to the other?
Well, I think they're both quite valid models depending on the circumstances. I think it's probably, as was demonstrated by the failure of the Rogers Plan, you had to start and first get some degree of trust in the mediator, as well as some degree of confidence with the adversary. And that had to be done, I think, incrementally, the way it started, the way it evolved. And Henry was uniquely accepted as a mediator because of the style he had achieved with both parties, and even with those who didn't play, the Jordanians, as it turned out. Mm-hmm. By the time the Nixon forward era ended, even Henry Kissinger was pretty well convinced, as the experts all were. It's hard to know how to go further on this road. We've got two agreements with Egypt, have one with Syria. The one with Jordan didn't work for perhaps mistaken reasons. But it's hard to see what another slice would achieve. And had the Nixon administration or the Ford administration continued, I suspect that they would have moved to try a comprehensive approach. But also, Jimmy Carter took office in '77, having been steeped in a concept that the Brookings administration report had produced, and also his own instincts that what was needed now, certainly, was a more comprehensive peacemaker's approach toward the region, no longer looking at little pieces of it and concentrating on the big power relationships to help you achieve them, but to go at all the parties with a package that had been pre-cooked in advance, more or less, and then endorsed by the international community. And also, Carter had a preoccupation with the problem of making peace in the Middle East per se. It wasn't just about U.S. interests, although certainly he had that concept. But peace was a real value, real peace for everybody. And his whole instinct was to try for a much bigger comprehensive solution. And he launched it immediately on taking office. There were some things said about the previous administrations which weren't very complimentary and certainly probably unfair. But I don't think that there's much argument that more incrementalism would probably not have gotten you very far at that moment.
Could I offer
Please.
I agree 100% with what Sam says, but I'd like to add a nuance to this.
Please.
The Nixon administration, as you know, was very, very careful to avoid any kind of confrontation with the Soviet Union. And I think that was a very, very wise decision. And I think that was a very wise decision to sometime around the time of the first shuttle, that is the January 1974 agreement between Egypt and Israel, we on Kissinger's airplane were using the phrase negotiating process to describe what we were doing. The idea was that one mediated or negotiated agreement would be placed on top of another, on top of another.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the journalists on the plane called it step-by-step diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an incremental approach at that earlier stage than Sam is talking about. But we did realize after that first agreement that something happened across the Middle East, especially in Egypt and Israel, but more broadly. And it certainly was added to by the Syrian disengagement. And what happened was that people more broadly began to ask, is something changing? Is peace possible? And I remember arriving in Tel Aviv when President Nixon went there in June of '74. And as our motorcade was pulling out of Ben Gurion Airport, there was an array of newspaper stands along the side of the road. I remember looking out of the window at an English language newspaper on the side of the road, and the headline in big letters was, "Is peace possible?" Now you put your mind back into that period of time. The fact that anybody would ask the question was interesting, but there it was. And we had started to call what we were doing not the negotiating process, but the peace process. And that's where that phrase was born. And it
He's the author of it, I think.
But I come back to Sam's point, because even at the beginning of the Carter administration, there was a sense that you had to proceed very carefully, incrementally, and so on. The objective could be, as you said, but the idea of building trust and building on it and so on, I think, became very important. It's almost a theology.
Let me touch on another point, Dennis, that I think is crucial, because the choice of mode also has to do with what leaderships you deal with. I think historic perspective would say that the great upheaval in Israeli political life that took place in 1977, the Labor Party, which had been in power since the beginning of the State of Israel, was thrown out. Menachem Begin and the Likud Party took power. This coincided with Carter's launching of this new comprehensive approach, which would involve serious negotiation with all the key parties before you get them together in a conference. And Carter, I think, initially did not understand what that upheaval in Israel meant. If you still had Rabin and Peres and Allon and Dayan, etc., in the government when the Carter administration took office, it seems to me there was a much better chance that the Israelis could have been brought to a comprehensive peace settlement ultimately. Would have been very tough, but that party and its leadership was in business to make peace for territory. Menachem Begin came in with an entirely different view, avoiding war because people thought he was going to be a warmonger. He wanted very much to demonstrate he wasn't for war. And he saw Egypt as the key to avoiding war. That was where the real threat was in his mind. He would never in a million years have agreed to give up territory in the West Bank. Ideologically, for him, it was part of Israel. And his entire career and those of his successors in the Likud have demonstrated, no matter how good our formulas have been, no matter how many times you've met with them, and I've met with them, and others have met with them, the instinct to hang on to at least large chunks of Judea and Samaria, ancient Israel, and the security high spots overwhelm any feeling of insecurity about making peace. And I must say that Begin was a different kind of leader for Israel. It took us a while to figure that out. But he did want to make peace with Egypt. And Sadat was ready to make peace with Israel. So that concept, what's ripe, can determine whether you go comprehensive or incrementally. Carter started out thinking it was all ripe, and he tried for several months and ran aground over partly over the fact that Syria wasn't going to allow anything to happen unless they were part of it, because they didn't trust the Egyptians either, not to make a separate deal. And by the time he ran aground, Sadat was worried he was going to lose his chance. Secret diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy, without us, had told both Begin and Sadat, there is a deal here that we might be able to make. And they were going to pursue that, and Carter came to realize it, much to the dismay, I might say, of Hal and others in Washington who didn't want to give up the concept Carter had started with and tried always to keep inserting it back into the equation. And therefore, the Camp David Agreement is ambiguous about a lot of things in order to remain alive with that option of some peace over the West Bank. Gaza was never the central issue. So I think it's all about what leaders you have at the moment, what they're prepared to deal with, and whether it is conceivable to make a comprehensive approach real in light of those leadership attitudes and the skills of the mediators, or whether you settle for what you can. And Camp David was, we settled for what we could at Camp David 1 and got a good promissory note on the West Bank, which we tried to cash, but in retrospect was never going to be cashable, not with the Begin administration or its successors.
Since we're really not here to talk about the Carter or subsequent administrations, but I think we have had a pretty good discussion on the kind of scope and logic of the Nixon years as it relates to this issue. Maybe we can wrap up by getting from each of you your own kind of concluding thoughts about the implications of those years for peace more generally in the region, and just your own sense of what the character of that diplomacy reveals about diplomacy in general.
I would start by saying I think the shuttles, go back to the Nixon period, represented a unique form of diplomacy in the modern world. That kind of active mediation made possible by modern technology. At that time, modern technology meant you had an airplane that you could fly back and forth with, and from which you could... A Xerox machine on the plane, which parenthetically, when the plane was in a long approach going into to Egypt, for instance, and it was tilted like this, the Xerox machine only printed on one side of the paper because the toner ran to one side. So much for technology, but of the day. Right. So my first point, though, is I think that I once said to a secretary on the plane who, after a particularly vigorous flight of retyping texts and stuff, she was about ready to collapse. I said, Chris, the only consolation you have is that just think, no other government in the world could do this. And it was true. And for those of us, you can tell from my body language and tone of voice that we felt we were involved in something powerful. And I think it was at the time. And it was a new form of diplomacy. And I'll voice one more thought, which gets outside the Nixon period, but begins there, and that is that one looks at the missed opportunities since Camp David and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. I think they were that the peace process was not picked up in the Reagan administration. That's one of the great tragedies of the last 30 years in this particular subject, to my mind. So I think a powerful base was laid in the Nixon administration. And one of the marvels to me was that when Carter came in with Secretary Vance, we didn't skip a step. We were on a plane to the Middle East 3 weeks after Carter's inauguration. We never wrote a briefing paper for Cyrus Vance to bring him up to date. He was up to date. And the only papers we wrote were, what can we do next? So there was another marvelous example of how the change of administrations, even across party lines, for something as serious as this, had nothing to do with that. We picked up the Nixon, Kissinger, Ford policy and went right on with it. And that's, I mean, we ended up at Camp David because we ended up not being able to do something else. But
Thank you. Bill?
I think what impressed me watching this policy making in the Nixon-Kissinger period up close is that the policies of the first several years of the Nixon administration toward the Middle East struck me at the time and strike me now as having missed opportunities. They could have done more with Sadat once he had come to power and the interim canal issue was on offer, back channel diplomacy, expulsion of the Soviet. Looking back on that period, we made a lot of mistakes by misunderstanding the regional context. We didn't know what Sadat was up to. Kissinger's genius, and I think Nixon's, in the midst of this crisis, which was a very serious crisis, October 73 war, was to correctly read the tea leaves. Helped along by Sadat's communicating to us. But it would have been very easy to say, this guy has deceived us, he's launched a war against the Israelis, why should we believe anything he's saying to us now? But they actually made a very quick and probably rather instinctive judgment that Sadat is somebody we may be able to work with. And therefore, every step over the next 20 some odd days was geared toward reaching an outcome that would be a basis from which you could launch diplomacy. So crises are going to happen in the world. The question is whether you can have an American foreign policy team that is well equipped to see, as Nixon used to say, the opportunity that lies within every crisis. I'm not an unquestioning fan of Richard Nixon, but on that point, he was quite right that things get shaken up in the midst of crises. And if you can exercise real leadership, you can then shape what comes next. And I think that Kissinger, backed by Nixon, did that very well in October. The other lesson I would draw from this whole period is that America can do peacemaking in a place like the Middle East well, when at the very, very highest level, which means the President and the Secretary of State, they genuinely believe that there are American national interests at stake. This is not just doing it because, you know, it's a nice thing to help people make peace. There was a real sense of why we're doing this. We had an oil embargo. We'd been on a nuclear alert. This was a war that was not supposed to have happened. And it didn't turn out the way we had expected it. So there was a very strong sense, we don't want this to happen again. And that carried over certainly into the Carter administration when I was again back in government. We knew why Middle East peace mattered. And it wasn't missionary work. It wasn't because we were, you know, just going to help the locals solve this little quarrel they had. We had a real sense that this mattered to us. So I would say that if you want to succeed in this business, make sure you've got a president with a Kissinger-like figure ready to work his team to the bones. And then make sure that the American public understands we're doing this because it matters to the United States.
Sam?
Well, I think everything Bill has said I would endorse. I do think that we've spoiled both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and maybe the rest of the Arabs, to think that diplomacy is only effective when the President or the Secretary of State are doing it. We've had a lot of special emissaries, including you, Dennis. And unfortunately, both the Israelis in particular, and I think the Arabs, don't take special emissaries very seriously anymore because they've had the experience of seeing what happens when there is that sort of high-level team commitment and engagement and commitment of time and energy, even maybe to the exclusion of other crises, that has been productive at moments in the past. Now the formula no longer works. You can use special emissaries quite well to negotiate and support and help work out logistics and all the rest. But that doesn't ever get the job all the way done and won't. And I think in a way it's too bad because our presidents and our secretaries of state have an entire world to worry about. And it's a tough world, it's getting tougher, not easier. So that how much the Middle East can claim legitimately of the daily commitment to 32-day shuttles of secretaries of state is problematic. Right now, for example, we have an Iran crisis. And that is the crisis as far as the Israelis are concerned. It's not the Palestinians. And it may be the crisis also more for some of the Arabs as well. We also have the residue of a war in Iraq and a Syria that we don't know where in the world it's going. How do you launch a new administration or a second-term administration into this in a way that will give you the sense of focus to produce another major step forward in peacemaking between the Palestinians and the Israelis when the local leaders have problematic domestic fronts, can't guarantee the support of their own people for a deal if they make one, and don't have the leadership skills necessary or the commitment maybe to seek it. I think this is the real dilemma for the next administration, whether it's Republican or Democratic, because I think at this moment the problem is not in Washington. The problem is in those leadership groups, and the time is not ripe, so that I think our presidents will have plenty of time to work on other issues, and Iran may be the first one.
Well, pick up on the very last point about the crisis that is Iran. I ask, would it be that size crisis today if we had not gone along so heavily with the Egyptian-Israeli piece and put the other pieces aside? President Nixon reopened doors all over the Arab world, and he left office with respect in the Arab world, as Eisenhower had done from the time of Suez. But we were, in a sense, seduced by the attractions of an Egyptian-Israeli agreement. Assad goes off and establishes himself as the leader of the Steadfastness and Resistance Front. The Palestinians fight among each other, and the whole situation becomes more complex, more difficult to work with, and willing players like Iran step in. So I end up wondering what would have happened if President Nixon had not left office the day after he signed my letters of credence to go to Damascus.
Well, there clearly is a correlation between that signature, Dick, and what's happened afterwards. But maybe I'll wrap it up, I guess, with a few observations. First, I think that this is an extraordinary collection of people, which we knew at the outset, given the combination of experiences and the insights that you collectively have drawn from those experiences. I think what does stand out for me, as someone who also took part in shuttle diplomacy, is that there was a diplomatic art form that was created by Henry Kissinger, but because you also had a president who very much invested in this, and so that creates a kind of a frame for action to begin with. I do also think that the notion that out of crises come opportunities, it's almost by definition that that's the case. Because the crises shake up the landscape. I come from California, so the earthquake metaphor is one that's often in my mind. The one thing you know about earthquakes is that the land's going to resettle, and you also have to act before it has resettled. And so here again, you had the sense of a recognition that there was a moment. I mean, if there is something in diplomacy that I've often myself have written about, I've often said that, just as in real estate, it's location, 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 in diplomacy, it's timing. Because timing creates particular moments, and if you don't act in those moments and you lose them, one of the things you find is that you may be worse off than if you hadn't had the moment at all, if you failed to take advantage of it. I think there's no doubt that in the history of Middle East diplomacy, there are certainly missed opportunities, and there's a lot of different reasons for why you miss the opportunities. I do think that when you look at where we are today, the context matters enormously. Many of the Arab leaders are either preoccupied with their own internal situations, which I think is going to continue to be a hallmark of the region for some time to come. Those who are not completely riveted on their internal situations are few and far between, and even those, there are some who are focused on Iran at the same time. So getting attention on the peace issue is not going to be such a simple proposition, either in the region or here. And one of the things that you need is not only the ability to see the stakes from here and apply the leadership from here, but you also need leaders out there who are prepared to take steps. And that also shapes the context. Now, one can say, to some extent, sometimes we have the ability to influence that, but I think we also have to have a certain degree of humility about what we can do and when we can do it. And if there was ever a time for humility as it relates to the Middle East as a whole, now is it. Since nobody predicted the upheaval that we've seen, now to hear from those who would claim that they know exactly what's going to happen, I think invites some degree of skepticism. But I do think that if in an era of upheaval and uncertainty and crisis, one thing that's needed is leaders who have the ability to look at the situation and understand it. And usually what's required for that is to have people like yourselves who are there to help them to understand it. So I want to thank you for helping all of us understand what was done during this period, and for, I think, giving some insight into these 5 years of Middle East diplomacy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you've been treated to a visit, looking back, to one of the most important moments in our history in the Middle East. I think each of the panelists have made points that are unique, authoritative, based upon their own standing as advisors at the hand of the President, the Secretary of State. I think as I look back on that period, having been in the White House at the time, what stands out for me is that the President came to office with a foundation knowledge of the stakes involved in the Middle East, that is, for all of humankind. Yes, the United States had important interests, and they weren't simply the flow of oil. We hadn't even become truly aware of our own vulnerability in that domain at that point. President Nixon came to office with an understanding that to be able to contribute usefully to forging greater stability, you had to be credible on both sides of the equation. And indeed, in his campaign, he set a very unpolitical standard for how he would approach the Middle East by saying that we must engage and understand Arab interest and the interest of Israel, and to be able to maintain credibility with both parties if ever we are to contribute usefully toward, if not reconciliation, at least a modus vivendi, peacefully. It would be hard to imagine today a presidential candidate with the courage to say, we will not take sides, as Bill Quandt underscored. And finally, I would say that when you look back on those years of tumult, period of less than 6 years' time in which, with the Soviet Union, the first important nuclear arms control agreement was reached. With China, an historic reopening that has prospered enormously in the years since. With Vietnam forging a negotiation that brought an end to the war and ultimately a better future. And finally, in the Middle East, the establishment of a process that has been carried forward to historic milestones of peace there that offer hope for continuity in the years ahead. That a president, truly under great duress, could have the presence of mind, the vision, the leadership skills to manage this process while concurrently achieving some of the most important experiences or results in the last half of the 20th century in U.S.-Soviet relations, in an opening to China, in ending the Vietnam War, and the capstone discussed here today is a measure of the skills, vision, leadership of former President Nixon. Thank you all for being here.